NumismaTalks. Every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon Mountain, we will be here with a new presentation. During this presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button on your screen to send in your question, and your question will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Larry Reed. Larry is President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education in Atlanta, Georgia. Before retiring to the emeritus role in 2019, he served as president of FEE for 11 years. Prior to that, he was founding president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan for 21 years and an economic professor at Northwood University for 7. He's author of 7 books, the most recent of which are Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. In 2023, the President of Poland bestowed upon Reed the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. That's a long title. The highest honor that Poland gives to a foreigner. Larry will be presenting Mellon and the Money, the story of great Treasury Secretary. It is all yours, Larry.
It's my pleasure to talk about a man I regard as my favorite Treasury Secretary of the nearly 80 men and women who have served in that position. Maybe I'm a little bit biased because Andrew Mellon was from Pittsburgh, and I was born and raised just 20 miles away in a little town of Beaver Falls. But I hope I can make the case here that he really was one of the best of the nearly 80 people since Alexander Hamilton to serve in that position. From 1921 to 1932, I want to show you, there's a picture of Andrew Mellon at his desk. From 21 until 32, he served Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover as Treasury Secretary. In our history, only 2 other individuals have ever served longer in that position. One of them, by the way, was Albert Gallatin, who is a remarkable and fascinating figure as well. He served as Treasury Secretary in the entirety of Jefferson's 2 terms, and then the entirety of Madison's first, and a few weeks into the second. And he'd also been a Pennsylvania congressman, senator, and he would later, after his time as Treasury Secretary, go on to be ambassadors to both France and Britain. So Mellon doesn't have quite the resume in that sense in terms of public positions. When he became Treasury Secretary in 1921, that was the first time he held a public office, appointed to that post by newly elected President Warren Harding. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in March of 1855. He died at 82 in 1937. He was a Scots-Irish Presbyterian and the son of a banker, which goes a long way, I think, in explaining his success in that profession. But he was successful in many things. He had an incredible knack for finding the right, most promising technologies, and then finding the right entrepreneurs to bet on. And because he was so successful at that, he built a financial and industrial empire in a variety of industries: steel, oil, shipbuilding, coal, coke, aluminum, and banking. Of course, most Americans, to the extent they know anything about him, may know that he was a key figure at the Alcoa Company. That's probably what he is best known for. Its success, the Alcoa Aluminum Company, its success was one of the many reasons that Mellon, by the time he was chosen by President Harding for the Treasury Secretary job, was one of the 3 wealthiest taxpayers in America, behind John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. And by the way, that position only paid $12,000 a year, which, even if you adjust for inflation, is a far cry from what Mellon had been earning in these other various capacities. But he'd sort of had enough of the business world and wanted to get into some public service at the age of 65. I think his greatest contribution to America was not the vast wealth that he created or helped to create, or financed into creation, or even the vast wealth that he gave away as a prominent philanthropist. But rather, I think his greatest contribution is the great wealth that his policies allowed millions of other Americans to produce. Here's a picture of him with two of the presidents that he served, Calvin Coolidge on the left and Herbert Hoover on the right. When Mellon came to Washington in 1921, under Warren Harding, the federal income tax had only been around less than a decade. It was passed and created in 1913, so it wasn't even 10 years old yet. And at the time of that debate in 1913, when Woodrow Wilson was president, there were opponents of the income tax who raised the specter that someday the top rate could go as high as 10%. And the supporters of the income tax scoffed at that. They said, oh, well, it'll never reach anything that high. But by the time Wilson left office, the very president under whom the income tax was created, the top rate was already 73%. That's the top rate that the Harding administration inherited when it came into office in March of 1921. A big reason for that, of course, was World War I, which we entered in 1917. But Mellon was an observant sort of guy, and he noticed that these high rates, he called them confiscatory, were prompting investors and entrepreneurs to seek refuge abroad or in sterile tax havens here at home. He noted multiple times that John D. Rockefeller's son had put most of his wealth not into the stock of his dad's company, namely Standard Oil, but instead in tax-exempt municipal bonds, because he would thereby escape the high income tax rates on income. Mellon argued that taxes had to be slashed, in his words, to attract the large fortunes back into productive enterprise. And he also noted, as Treasury Secretary, that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. And one of the bits of evidence that he cited to make that case is that of Henry Ford, a contemporary, of course. He pointed out that Henry Ford made more money by reducing the prices of his cars from $3,000 to just $380. He made more money by slashing the price and greatly increasing his sales than he would have earned by simply keeping the price high, even if he earned more profit per car. He just would have sold a lot fewer cars at $3,000 than he sold at $380. So Mellon pressed Congress relentlessly with the support of Harding and Coolidge to lighten up, to get those high rates down, especially since World War II was over. And federal revenues were high and didn't need to be that high, and the income tax rates didn't need any longer to be so confiscatory. So Mellon, under Harding and Coolidge, pushed for all the tax rate reductions they could get from Congress. And by 1929, when the Congress had passed his sixth tax cut of the decade, the top rate had been lowered by 2/3 from that very high 73% that he and Warren Harding had inherited from Wilson, all the way down to 24%. And those in the lowest income tax bracket, people earning under $4,000 annually, saw their rates fall by an even greater percentage, from 4% all the way down to 0.5%. Here's a quote from Mellon. I want to read it to you because it summarizes very well his perspective, his philosophy of tax reductions. He said, "The history of taxation shows that taxes which are inherently excessive are not paid. The high rates inevitably put pressure on the taxpayer to withdraw his capital from productive business and invest it in tax-exempt securities or to find other lawful methods of avoiding the realization of taxable income. The result is that the sources of taxation are drying up. Wealth is failing to carry its share of the tax burden, and capital is being diverted into channels which yield neither revenue to the government nor profit to the people. There were so many exemptions introduced, as well as tax rate reductions in the Harding and Coolidge years between 1921 and 29, that the number of Americans who actually paid federal income taxes fell by 1 million. The budget itself, you might think, oh, with lower rates and all these people not paying taxes at all, maybe the budget was out of whack. Not at all. In fact, it boasted a surplus every year of the Coolidge and Harding presidencies. And at the same time, those presidents with Mellon guiding or steering the helm cut the national debt by almost half. That's been rarely done in American history. The only time the national debt ever went to zero was briefly during the Andrew Jackson administration in the early 1830s. Mellon also did his best to cut the federal estate tax. He wanted to abolish it, but Congress in the end only cut it by half, from about 40% down to 20%. Still, that's a major reduction, and it greatly benefited the American people and the economy. Burton Folsom, his historian, points out in his book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, quote, "The result in government revenue was a startling triumph. The personal income tax receipts for 1929 were over 1 billion, in contrast to the 719 million raised just 8 years ago in 1921, when tax rates were so much higher. The economy in this same period grew by about 60%. America was awash in new inventions, and American wages became the envy of the world. We call this period, of course, the Roaring Twenties, and such things as radio were invented at this time. I want to stress that Mellon enjoyed the full support of President Coolidge, and you can see this quote in the next slide that suggests this. He said in 1925, "The wise and correct course to follow in taxation and all other economic legislation is not to destroy those who have already secured success, but to create conditions under which everyone will have a better chance to be successful." Coolidge and Mellon felt very strongly that's exactly what they were doing by such measures as cutting high tax rates. Coolidge and Mellon, by the way, were alike in their personalities. Both were kind of socially awkward and painfully shy in large groups. We refer to Calvin Coolidge often as Silent Cal because of the mistaken impression that he didn't say much while he was president. But you know, he still holds the record among all US presidents for the most news conferences of any president while in office. But he earned the Silent Cal moniker because it was in social occasions, social gatherings, parties, that kind of thing, small talk occasions that he kind of clammed up. He wasn't the kind of guy to rattle on in social occasions. The journalist Dorothy Parker famously has noted, you may have seen this quote, she sat next to him in the White House during a dinner of some sort, and she turned to the president and said, "Mr. Coolidge, I'll bet I can get you to say 3 words." And Coolidge's famous response was, "You lose." Both Coolidge and Mellon took enormous delight in the private time they had with their families. Both were lovers of pets and animals. Coolidge had a pet raccoon that had free reign of the White House. It was called Rebecca. And he was once given a parrot, which he kept for some time, a parrot that was trained to say, "What about the appropriation?" And Coolidge always got a kick out of that because, he was always fighting the requests from people and interest groups all over the country to give them something from the federal treasury. And he hated that sort of thing, but he got a kick out of the parrot constantly saying, "What about the appropriation?" He also raised chickens in the White House backyard. He had 2 lion cubs, and he named them Tax Reduction and Budget Bureau. Mellon liked animals too, but I think he was even fonder of his custom-made all aluminum car. I don't know that there's ever been a second one made. To his further credit, Secretary Mellon exerted his influence on the spending side of government too, and with the full support of first Harding and then Coolidge. In 1928, 7 years after he took office as Treasury Secretary, total expenditures of the federal government were just slightly below where they had been when they started. And that's just a record that nobody's been able to beat. So Coolidge was able to leave office saying that the federal government was ever so slightly smaller than he found it when he became president upon Harding's death in 1923. Burton Folsom, again, the historian, figured out how many employees at Treasury Andrew Mellon got rid of during his time at the Treasury Department. And he says it averaged one Treasury staffer per day for every single day of his time as Treasury Secretary. I don't think there's been another cabinet head who could ever say they reduced the size of their own agency by anything like that. It's worth noting, incidentally, that the country, years before the Great Depression began in 1929, the country endured a very sharp economic contraction early in Mellon's tenure in Washington, in the Harding administration, the 1921 Depression. And I'm sure you have noted, or you'll agree with me, that that is a depression that doesn't enjoy the notoriety of the Great Depression, not by a long shot. Most people have even forgotten that we had one in 1921. It was a very serious downturn with unemployment well into double digits. But what makes that depression notable is that it was over with in a matter of months. Very sharp, but we had a bounce back that put people back to work rather quickly. James Grant is the author of a fantastic book on this subject called The Forgotten Depression of 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself. And he points out that the reason that the 1921 Depression was so brief has to do with the policies of Harding and Mellon. They didn't come in with the idea that, oh my gosh, we have high unemployment, we have to spend more money, raise the national debt, regulate more, create new agencies, all that sort of thing that was done later under Hoover and FDR. Instead, they said we've got to cleanse the system of its excesses. The Depression of 1921, they figured properly, was the result of the inflation to pay for World War I, the printing of money in Washington, the steady devaluation of the dollar in overseas markets. And they said, we have to fix all that, give the world confidence to invest in America again, and get the government off the backs of the American people. So they cut spending and taxes, they reduced the debt, balanced the budget, they refrained from the kind of regulatory interventions that would have prolonged that depression, just as they would do, as such interventions would do later under Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt. Let me show you a chart here about the tax rates, the marginal income tax rates, and how they were affected by the Mellon tax plan. In 1913, the first year of the federal income tax, made possible by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, the lowest rate was 1% on income between $0 and $20,000. And of course, the great majority of Americans didn't make $20,000 a year in 1913. So it had minimal immediate impact. The top rate was 7% on incomes of $500,000 and up. And that's equivalent to, that $500,000 is roughly equivalent to about $16 million today, 7%. And the exemptions were, as you see, the first $3,000 of income for individuals and the first $4,000 for joint filers were exempt, and virtually all middle-class Americans were entirely excused from paying income taxes. They just didn't qualify. 3 years later, The top rate, which was supposed to never exceed 10%, was 15%. And our involvement in World War I hadn't started yet. That occurs in 1917, and rates were, the top rate was jacked up to 67% in that year. 1918 to 73%, where it stayed until Harding and Mellon assumed office in March of 1921. The lowest rate also doubled, by the way, from 1% to 2%. But by 1929, after 6 tax cuts pushed by Mellon, the top rate was down to 25 or 24 and a fraction, I think. And the lowest rate had fallen to 1.5%. And that might be an error on my slide. I think it was 0.5%. In any event, considerable reductions, both in the highest income tax bracket and in the lowest. With the support of those two presidents, these tax cuts helped the economy recover from the Depression of 1921. But there are many more things that are worthy of note during the Mellon time at the Treasury Department. With the next slide, and sorry for the glare in the upper one, that I didn't take the bill out of its plastic sleeve, so I got a little glare there. But you can see that the top note is the size of American banknotes before Andrew Mellon engineered a substantial reduction in their size. The bottom dollar bill is one of our dollars of today, and you can see it's about a 20% or so reduction in size. And if you're wondering, well, why did Mellon reduce the size of American paper currency? Again, it was to save money. He just thought they didn't need to be that big, and that we'd save a lot of money if we cut the size. And that, of course, has remained the case to this day. Can you imagine the size of our wallets today if we had to carry bills the size of what they were before he cut them in 1927? Also, I want to show you some money supply numbers here, or a chart, because this figures into the coming of our calamity in 1929 called the Great Depression. Some people blame Mellon or Coolidge for it. I will make the case that they were not to blame. But you can see in the 2021 Depression, money supply tumbled, as it typically does in downturns. But then the Federal Reserve began to pump things up again. And from 1923 to 1929, we had had about a 60% expansion of money and credit, and then a spike very late in that process. You can see in the middle of the chart around late 1929, and then a substantial fall in money supply. It collapsed by at least 50%. I can't recall the exact number, but you can see it was quite substantial. And that's because after years of expanding money and credit, helping to fuel the bad side of the roaring 20s, you might say, because it was not sustainable, the Federal Reserve had been depressing interest rates during the 1920s. The cut in tax rates certainly helped us, but the cut in interest rates and the easy money would lay the foundation for a correction later. And we got it big time with the Great Depression that began in 1929. Money supply will contract substantially, and not until about 1934 did you start to see, or three, did you start to see a recovery in the money supply. Also, I have to say a few words about prohibition, because it was in full force throughout all the years that Andrew Mellon was Treasury Secretary. And you might wonder, what was his position on it? As head of the Treasury Department, he was in charge of enforcing prohibition, which had been put in place under Woodrow Wilson, and which required the federal government to ban alcohol. Mellon himself detested prohibition. He made no secret of that. He was never in favor of it. He regarded it as unenforceable meddling in private habits, but he, as long as he was Treasury Secretary, had to carry out the law. Because the Treasury agents who served in the Prohibition Bureau of the Treasury Department were underpaid and overworked, they were more than a little susceptible to bribery. 2/3 of, of Treasury Department employees within the Prohibition Bureau, 2/3 were forced out eventually on either suspicion or proof of corruption, which proved Mellon's hunch that the whole effort was futile and counterproductive. As an interesting side note, during this period, foreign embassies, because they're foreign property, were exempt from prohibition. Located in effect on foreign soil within the United States, they could provide alcohol to their guests, regardless of US law. And Congress came to resent this. They knew that these foreign embassies were the occasions for many parties with illegal booze. And so in 1923, Congress demanded of Mellon, they wanted him to tell them how much liquor the embassies were importing. And he was ordered by the House of Representatives to provide a detailed report on the import of alcohol and its use in foreign embassies in the United States. He steadfastly refused. He said he wouldn't do it. And he claimed, I think rightly, that such a disclosure would violate diplomatic immunity. I mean, how could you even enforce that? I mean, you'd either have to just take the word for what embassy officials claim is the alcohol they have in their possession or being imbibed at their parties, or you'd have to send troops in and raid foreign embassies, which he, of course, could not do either. But the Roaring Twenties, I don't want to say that the reason that we had such a good economy for a time was entirely due to Andrew Mellon and the policies of Harding and Coolidge getting the government out of the way. Because, as I alluded earlier, the Federal Reserve was doing something to the money supply that was fueling the good times in a very unsustainable way. We know from more recent experience that when the Federal Reserve gooses the economy by artificially lowering interest rates, you do get a boom of some sort at the early part of this period, but then it just sets up the potential fall. It sets up a correction at some point when all the bad investments fueled by the easy money have to be sloughed off. But the Fed was driving interest rates in the 1920s to historic lows. It created a bubble, and that bubble burst when the Fed began to reverse itself in 1929. Now think of this, you had about a 66% expansion of the money supply by the Fed from 24 to 29. But then from 29 to 33, you had at least a 1/3 contraction of the money supply. Depending on what measure you look at, it was even a greater reduction. They started jacking up interest rates relentlessly in early 1929. And by the summer, the smart money realized that the bloom was off the rose. It was time to get out. And it was the pressure of the smart money selling stocks in late summer 1929 that cooled off the stock market. And weeks before the big crash in October, you had some really bad days on the stock market. The wealthy people said, hey, the Fed is taking the punch away from the party. They're jacking up interest rates. Get out now while you can. It wasn't until the masses of people sensed this change in the air and stampeded out of the market that you got Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, and many subsequent bad days thereafter. Of course, with the collapse of the stock market and the economy and soaring unemployment late in the decade and of the 20s and the start of the 30s, the popularity of Herbert Hoover as president just collapsed. Everybody knows of the so-called Hoovervilles around the country, places where homeless or unemployed people would gather, often preparing their meals outside on the sidewalk, selling apples if they could, that kind of thing. That's very much an image from America's Great Depression. There's also a story I haven't been able to verify, but I have seen references to it on multiple occasions, where near the bottom of his popularity, Hoover went to give a speech somewhere in Washington, and Secretary Mellon went with him. And afterwards, Hoover headed for a payphone because he wanted to make a phone call, which at that time would cost you a nickel. And supposedly he said to Mellon, have you got a nickel? I need to call a friend. And Mellon gave him a dime and said, here, call them both. So again, I can't promise that that is verifiable, but there have been many references to it. You can't talk about Mellon at Treasury and his record without factoring in the Great Depression. I mean, did he in any way lay the foundation for the Great Depression? Was it caused in part by his policies of tax and debt reduction, spending reduction? I don't believe so. And this is a topic for a much longer presentation, but I just briefly want to tell you what I think caused and prolonged the Great Depression. It wasn't tax cuts. They were both needed and very helpful, very productive. You have really, I think, four phases of the Great Depression that explain where it came from and why it lasted as long as it did. The first phase is the monetary phase, and I've alluded to that already. You had an expansion of money and credit by the Federal Reserve, a very substantial one that drove interest rates to all-time lows and produced a bubble in the economy. And then the Fed followed that by a serious contraction. I was present at a birthday party, the 90th birthday party for Milton Friedman, the economist, at the White House. And Ben Bernanke, then the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, turned to Friedman and said, "You were right. We won't do that again." And what he was saying, in effect, to Friedman was, your criticism of Fed policy as the cause of the Great Depression was exactly right. We miscalculated back in those days. I see a mistake on my slide. This is 2932. It should be 1932. And then the Fed didn't just stabilize after inflating, it actually contracted the money supply. It got out of control. I don't think they intended to slash it, but they sat idly by as the money supply fell and banks collapsed by the thousands. But even as late as the spring of 1930, with Mellon still, by the way, in charge of the Treasury, you didn't have a depression yet. Months after the collapse of the stock market, all we had was a recession. Unemployment was about 8%. The stock market, which had so many bad days in October and November and December of 1929, had actually, in the early months of 1930, had rebounded and regained half of the ground that it had lost. So things weren't looking so bad. But then in June of 1930, you have the beginning of the second phase of the Great Depression, which we call the disintegration of the world economy. Congress passed and President Hoover mistakenly signed into law the highest tariffs in American history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act or Revenue Act of 1932. Smoot-Hawley was devastating. It raised tariffs to an all-time high, virtually closed the borders. Foreign governments retaliated against us. They, in effect, said, if you're going to put high tariffs on our stuff, we're going to do the same to your stuff. And so any industry dependent even indirectly upon world commerce suffered because of the passage of this high tariff act. And unemployment quickly soared into double digits. But then something happened in 1932 that Andrew Mellon was dead set against and did not support, and which led in part to his leaving the Hoover administration at Treasury. The Revenue Act of 1932, in the midst of of soaring unemployment, well into the 20 percentile bracket, Congress doubled the income tax in the face of sky-high unemployment. And the reason they did that was they thought, well, look at this massive budget deficit, which was generated by so many people not working, so many companies having gone bankrupt, farmers walking off the farms in bankruptcy all over the country because of Smoot-Hawley and the Fed continuing to contract the money supply. Well, that act of 1932 raised income taxes way back up again. The highest rate was raised up to about 65%. And that was essentially the end of the Mellon tax cut legacy. And in Congress, people start to really attack him and incorrectly claim that the Depression was brought on by his tax cuts and so forth. So Hoover thought it would be best to send him off to Europe, and he becomes U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. But then you had other things. I don't want to get into them here, but when Hoover ran against Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, believe it or not, Roosevelt ran against Hoover on a platform of Hoover was, in the words of Roosevelt's running mate, John Nance Garner, leading the country down the path to socialism. Hoover raised taxes, raised tariffs, and FDR hit him hard on that, and he was right. But of course, once he took office as the next president, he did just the opposite of what he promised, and the highest tax rate would, before Roosevelt was done, would exceed 90%. He once proposed, incidentally, a 100% income tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. Roosevelt did. Congress didn't give it to him. Then he retaliated, or actually, I'm sorry, he proposed a 99%. He then retaliated against Congress, who wouldn't approve that, by imposing a 100% income tax rate at the top level of incomes by executive order. And fortunately, it never went into effect because Congress overrode it. But you can see simply jacking up taxes and trying to get them even higher was effectively the end of the Mellon tax cut legacy. And there were other interventions that caused the Great Depression to linger 3 or 4 times longer than any previous depression in American history. And if there's interest in what these other interventions were, like the Wagner Act in phase 4, in the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer that. But Mellon died in 1937 at the age of 82. In the last few years of his life, Franklin Roosevelt went after him. He sicked the IRS on him, trying to get him for tax evasion, but they never laid a glove on him. He was exonerated, never proven. In fact, I think in the end, the IRS owed him money. And a few years later, after his death, the U.S. Treasury honored him by putting his image on a U.S. postage stamp. He was also one of the greatest philanthropists of his day, and he made a gift of his very substantial art collection, along with $10 million, to establish the National Gallery of Art, which we enjoy in Washington, D.C. to this day. So with that, I want to conclude and say that I think Andrew Mellon's legacy is, by and large, a very good one. He certainly meant well, and he succeeded for years in reducing the income tax burden on the American people, only to see it reversed in subsequent presidencies. But I think he could still, in 1937, when he passed away, hold his head high, feeling as though he had done his duty and the best that he could. So thank you. And if we have questions, I will be happy to take them.
Okay, if you do have questions, go ahead and pop them in that Q&A. While we do that, I'm just going to give some information here and see if anybody has any questions. So I just want to thank you, Larry, very much for that great presentation, and thank you everybody that joined us. Our NumismaTalks are being recorded and will be available on our website once they're edited. Please be sure to check for future programs at money.org under the Education tab. We have a question pop up. How does the events in 1929 parallel the events in 2020s?
Good question. I often get that because in many ways we have been repeating some of the same mistakes that were made in the 1920s. The Federal Reserve has never really gotten us off this roller coaster of goosing the economy with easy money and low interest rates, prompting some sort of a boom, only later to prick that balloon, and then we then suffer the consequences. If you go back to, say, 2008, it's so obvious that before the start of the Great Recession of that year, the Fed was doing what it did in the 1920s. We had After 9/11 in 2001, we had 6 or 7 years of very rapid money and credit creation. We had an economy that it would have been booming, except there were other policies of government that were suppressing it. But nonetheless, it was setting us up for some kind of correction. We got it in the big one of 2008. And now here we are in 2024 with the Fed at the moment trying to counter its previous policy of easy money by raising interest rates. It just cut them finally, but it's always erring in one direction or the other excessively. I remember 2 years ago when economists like me were warning, hey, all this easy money, this massive federal spending is going to spur price inflation. And we were hoping the Fed would step on the brakes, but it didn't until we started to see sky-high price inflation. So belatedly, the Fed began to jack up rates, and only recently have they begun to move in the other direction. So whether or not they have begun to move in an easier money direction soon enough to avoid a recession, time will tell. But I'm one of those economists who wish that the Fed would pursue, if we're going to have a Fed, and I think the argument is powerful that we don't need it, but if we're going to have one, at least a stable monetary policy makes more sense than these discretionary expansions and contractions of money and credit.
Okay, we do have another one. Without the causes on the 1929 depression, would Mellon's tax methods help today's economy by lowering inflation?
Well, inflation is not really a tax phenomenon, it's a monetary phenomenon. So you could have high tax rates or low tax rates, and you could have high price inflation or low price inflation. That depends on what is happening to the money and credit supply. When you lower tax rates, though, you do tend to give people more incentive for things like investment, work extra hours, create a business, take a chance, be an entrepreneur. That's always helpful because it tends to produce more goods and services in the long run. And that keeps prices somewhat in check. But it's money supply that determines where prices are going to go more than anything else. These days, of course, we have a problem that Mellon and the presidencies of that period did not have. We start out right now with massive federal budget deficits. The Treasury just reported that the fiscal year that ended up on October 1 saw a $1.8 trillion budget deficit. And we see our national debt soaring as a result of it. So that kind of puts a restriction on what we can do. The only way you can really fix that problem is on the spending side. But nobody in Washington seems to really want to tackle federal spending, which has exploded in recent years. So I'm one of those who say cut spending, and then you can more safely cut taxes as well.
Okay, in 1929, were company stocks purchased with credit?
In 1929, were company stocks purchased with credit? Oh, yes. Yeah, or on margin, as it was called. Yes. And sometimes people say, it was the low margin requirements of those days that fueled this rampant speculation on the stock market. But margin requirements at the end of that decade were no higher or lower than they were at the start of the decade. So again, I think it's more what the Fed was doing with the money supply, with the stock market being a symptom than not the cause of the crash of 1929. But yes, you could buy stock on credit as you can today.
Fascinating presentation. One of my favorites, says this person. Sounds like a lot like today. What is your opinion of Mellon's successor and the abrogation of the gold clause?
Oh, that's a great question. Henry Morgenthau, I think, was his successor. Yes, there might have been somebody briefly in between, but Morgenthau, who ended up serving even longer than Mellon, was Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt. And when it comes to the gold clause, I think this is one of the more infamous actions of the Roosevelt administration. In April of 1933, in office just for a month, Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring that Americans turn in their monetary gold. In other words, not the gold that was in your teeth, but your gold coins, turn them into the Treasury by May 1st. You had less than a month, and you had to do it under penalty of $10,000 in fines or 10 years in prison or both. Would set up an interesting dynamic. Roosevelt also got rid of prohibition at the end of 33. Now, if you think about it, a year ago, if two guys were walking down the street, one of them had a gold coin in his pocket and the other one had a bottle of booze in his hands, the guy with the bottle of booze would be the criminal and the guy with the gold coin would be the honest citizen. But a year later, with prohibition repealed and gold coins seized by the federal government, just the opposite was the case. The guy with the booze was a honest citizen breaking no law, and the guy with the gold coin was the crook. So I think that abandoning gold simply because they wanted to spend and print more money has had very bad long-term consequences. And abrogating the gold clause in our contracts was, I think, I would have ruled it unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court unfortunately ruled the other way. But that's an infamous moment in American history. Even Morgenthau raised questions about it. And I should point out, in 1939, Treasury Secretary Morgenthau made a famous statement that Roosevelt was very angered by. He made the public statement that after all these years of our administration, all this spending, things are no better today than when we started. It doesn't work, which is quite a testimony from a Treasury Secretary about his previous 8 years.
Okay, we've got one more in here. As this is talking about current times, would an increased income tax on the wealthy help the economy?
I don't think so, because the wealthy, they're the folks in the country who usually have the most options for getting around it or escaping it. They can take their money and put it overseas. They can hire the lawyers to figure out how to escape those things, or they'll buy more tax-exempt municipal securities, which certainly help finance local government, but don't do anything to produce capital needed for the growth of private industry where jobs are created. So, no, I think the problem in Washington, frankly, is not that we don't tax enough, it's that we spend too much. And a $35 trillion national debt should be all the evidence of that we need.
Okay, that looks like the last question. So I just want to thank you again, Larry, for a great presentation, and everybody that joined us. I hope you all have an amazing day.
Thank you, Paula.